For our final session, we're coming to our final session now. I'm glad to bring to the stage my friend and colleague, Garrett Graff, our own Director of Cyber Initiatives at the Aspen Institute, part of Aspen Digital, and Rob Joyce, who most of you already know, is the current Director of the Cybersecurity Directorate at the National Security Agency. And over to you. Thank you.
So, thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Rob, for joining us. You have been a friend of the Aspen Cyber Summit for many years now, and it's great to have you back on the stage in yet another new role.
It's awesome to be here.
Let me start by actually asking you about something that we saw from the NSA in the last 24 hours here, where we saw you and other government partners put out a warning about VPN vulnerabilities. And I wonder if you could talk both a little bit about the purpose of that as a warning, and what, if anything, you can say that prompted it at this moment, but then also talk a little bit more about what seems to be a growing strategy of these joint warnings from government to consumers and companies about the types of things that government wishes people were paying more attention to.
Sure, Garrett. So this was a document that talked about what you should have in consideration for securing your VPNs. And it was done jointly with CISA. They're our deep partner these days, right? There's almost nothing we put out that we don't do jointly with CISA, often CISA, NSA, and FBI together. And we looked at it and said, there's so much online, right? There is so much effort to be safe online, and what we wanted were the criteria for how you do that. And it really came down to two things. One, the selection, making sure you had a reputable product, and two, how you locked it down and removed some of the vulnerabilities from that space. And we thought between the deep technical expertise and what we saw in foreign space from folks exploiting those, it was good advice that government could give out there, and last 24 hours, a lot of really great response to that kind of information and sharing.
And was there any specific incident that triggered this, or specific threat that you were seeing behind the scenes that sort of led you to do this in September rather than a couple of months ago or a couple of months from now?
Yeah, no specific warning. It really is the culmination of watching the ecosystem working together to coordinate really good, positive advice, distill it down. That's the other thing. We can write 50 pages easily. It's when you try to get things down to a consumable, action-oriented outcome that it's much harder. So it just took some time.
Yeah. So 4 years ago, you were at the White House as the cyber coordinator with the National Security Council in the first year of the Trump administration. Talk to us a little bit about how now in the first year of the Biden administration, the threat landscape looks different to you, and what's changed and sort of what's at the top of your radar right now.
Yep. So you've heard it woven throughout today, right? The idea that cyber crime has become a national security issue. That to me is a dramatic change, and you see the government utilizing all elements of our power to include the foreign intelligence team and the offensive cyber team out there in the efforts to work against ransomware. So, we work very closely with the FBI, CISA, and others, to include Treasury. And in that space, it's very clear that even though it's a criminal issue, indictments and arrests aren't going to push us out the other end of that tunnel. So we've got to get a more complex playbook. And so it's got all of us talking about the tools and infrastructure, the ecosystem, because if you can't make profit from it, you're disincentivized. The people, because as we identify them, there's all sorts of action that can happen. And then finally, that safe haven. And it's really clear, as long as there's safe havens like Russia, there's going to be this problem. So intel-driven diplomacy and figuring out how we're going to work with allies to move Russia off the point where these criminals feel that they're untouchable in that space. So that's certainly the number one, is the ransomware activity. Number two is the topic that Chris Krebs and the Aspen Foundation are so invested in. That's the disinformation space. we've watched people use the cyber environment both as a cybersecurity problem, but also just as a malign influence problem. That's big change too. Third is we still have the nation state threats, right? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they roll off so easy because those are the big ones we always see doing very, just obnoxious things in cyberspace. And they haven't dialed back. They're still continuing. It's a testament that the cyber crimes rising above that noise floor, but they're still there. And things like the Microsoft Exchange server hacks that hit just massive amounts of entities across the globe. The SolarWinds supply chain attack show that they are looking to, at scale, achieve and maintain presence. Both for intel, but also for operational activity, and also staying in that space so that they have the agility to move to places they can't predict today that they might want to go to tomorrow. And then finally, I'd say it's the critical infrastructure. We've always known and worried about the presence in the critical infrastructure, but the last 5 years, it's just, it's the case where we're seeing and aware of much more intent and capability against that, and it's a world that's got to be locked down for our national security.
Let me take you through those sort of 4 nation-state threats, because we actually, one of the things that's unique about the Cyber Summit this year is in past years, that is normally what we spend much of the day talking about, or those sort of big 4, and today it has been a ransomware conversation sort of threaded through instead many of our topics. What does Russia look like to you online today? And leaving aside the question of the ransomware and cybercrime aspect of it, where do you see its nation-state level activity focused?
Yeah. They are the disruptive force. They're often trying to not increase their activity, but tear down others. So you see the misinformation, malign information. They are very active in the intelligence gathering activities still, both against governments, critical infrastructure. And then the concern is that effort that we've seen them actively use disruptive effects around the globe. And we've seen evidence of pre-positioning against U.S. critical infrastructure. So all things that can't be tolerated and we need to work against.
And you are the author of what is probably the most famous line about nation-state cyber threats. Russia is a hurricane, China is climate change.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to claim ownership of that, but it certainly got picked up as a quote when Krebs and I were doing a discussion.
Well, he had a much less memorable version of it. And I wonder if you could sort of talk then about China, and does China sort of still look like climate change to you?
They do. Scope and scale, China's off the charts, right? The amount of Chinese cyber actors dwarfs the rest of the globe combined. So they have scale. You talked about the difference 4 or 5 years ago to today. The difference I see is we respected them less. It was always broad, loud, and noisy. And what we're finding, when you have a resource base that large, that the elite in that group really are elite, right? It's a law of large numbers. And so the high end of the Chinese sophistication is really good. So we've got to continue to understand, disrupt, and then find ways across the whole of that technology to kind of push back. I like I think it was Kevin Mandian earlier today talked about the hockey analogy, where if you just keep shooting at goal and it's undefended, eventually you're going to score. That's how we feel across a number of these nation-state activities is, yes, defense is really important, but you also have to work to disrupt. So that's the continuous engagement strategy out of the department. And the idea that we've got to put sand and friction in their operations so they don't get just free goal, shots on goal to keep trying and trying and trying. And folks think about that when they hear persistent engagement, continuous engagement kind of terms, they think offensive cyber. It is, but I would say that the releases we've done jointly with CISA and FBI about the end-day vulnerabilities that those teams like to use. That knocks them back just as much and is just as important. So finding those ways that we expose tools and infrastructure, that we continue to bring other elements of the government, and especially work with the international community to push back, establishing the expectation that these things won't be tolerated. That's all really vital.
Let me spend another minute talking about China, because we've seen some public reporting over the course of this fall about sort of the rise of the blurred lines in China between nation-state activity and cybercrime, which is something that we've seen very steadily from Russia over the years, where you have sort of nation-state hackers by day, criminals by night, or vice versa. And I wonder, at the same time, we've seen, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about the switch from Chinese hacking sort of being primarily done by the PLA, moving over to the Ministry of State Security under Xi. And I wonder if you could sort of talk to whatever level of detail you'd like about how you view those entities and sort of how you view that current evolution of what we're seeing from China.
Yeah, so across the entities, both in the military and the intel services, they're robust and resourced, right? So large teams, evolving techniques, and we see them looking to develop new tradecraft and then pass it down so it scales to bigger and broader. There are criminal elements, but what we often see is they're the commercial elements who by day are supporting those government activities, and then by night using some of the same tools, infrastructure, and other activities. And I think it's really important China understands how much of a risk that is to them, that these uncontrolled actors are, ambiguously combined with their activities, and that's a problem.
And Kevin was talking about this earlier today, that you go back a decade and he had sort of his database of 40 APTs thereabouts, and now 2,900. What does that sort of look like on your side as you're trying to monitor these threats and the proliferation of cyber actors?
What we're seeing is there's a lot of tradecraft that utilizes commercial, open source, and even outdated tools because they work. They aren't going to get you into the most protected networks, but many of the targets are soft enough that you can come in with those commercial tools. And what we've seen is we've seen whole APTs kind of go dark to some of the commercial entities who said, yeah, I don't see those custom tools from name your favorite threat actor group, when in reality they're just as active, but what they're using now is some of the commercial tools that get them to the same outcomes. So it's clouded that space. We do see there's always interest. We talk about the big four in cybercrime, but almost every nation in the world now has a cyber exploitation program. The vast majority of those are used for espionage and intelligence purposes. But there is interest in dabbling in offensive cyber and outcomes. The difference between the top of the list and the bottom of the list usually is scale. The idea of how many people they have, how many resources they can bring to bear, how much they can do at once. There's really some high-end, sophisticated small actors, but they're confined to whatever that national interest is that they're aimed at. So we see less of them.
Any you'd care to name at this time?
No, thanks.
And then going back to those big four, talk a little bit about Iran, talk a little bit about North Korea, countries that we haven't heard a lot about, sort of rising above the noise of the last couple of years, or the last year or so, but assuming are sort of still out there and actively engaged.
Iran's still active. They were certainly first and foremost back when everybody was talking about the bank's DDoS and the Shmoon wiper virus. Still actively engaged in offensive cyber, but what we're seeing is they're often very focused on regional things right now, right? They haven't been as focused on broader impacts, but they're capable, and most importantly, they're dangerous because they're less judicious in what they decide is a reasonable action. And I think at times Iran doesn't understand just how much they've gone up to and even over the line, to the point where they've drawn the ire and concern of the greater community.
In North Korea?
North Korea is still very, very focused on creating wealth for the regime, because there's not many more sanctions the world can put on North Korea, and so they've got to find ways to generate currency, to make exchange, and they found that stealing Bitcoin is often easier than stealing from the Bank of Bangladesh. So they haven't been hitting the biggest banks quite as aggressively because they're making their money in the crypto space.
Yeah.
We also see they really, the commercial firms were dealing with a lot of North Korean issues back when the vaccine was an issue. They were going after the intellectual property of vaccine makers. So still active, still a threat, very capable, but mostly focused on crypto exchanges and creating money.
You mentioned in that context Bitcoin again, which is something that we've heard sort of come up a couple of times in both specific and then more generally cryptocurrency. How much of the ransomware problem do you see as a criminal problem, and how much of it is a cryptocurrency problem?
Yeah, I don't know how to gauge those. I mentioned the 4 levers we see. We've got to go after all of that, right? Certainly, without profit, there is no ransomware problem. And the way the profit comes out these days is through crypto. Crypto is both a benefit and a liability. You saw some awesome DOJ activities where cryptocurrency was seized. There's ability to watch those transactions. They're all very public. The question is, can you de-anonymize and connect them in? There's opportunity and risk in the crypto space.
Let me ask you a couple of questions here about your current role atop the Cybersecurity Directorate. This is a directorate within NSA that was stood up by Ann Neuberger circa 2 years ago. When you arrived earlier this year to take over the directorate, sort of what is the top of your agenda for the next couple of years, and what do you see as the way that fits into this broader constellation of government tools right now?
Sure. Well, the key aspect we have in the Cybersecurity Directorate is we have that foreign intelligence against the cyber threat landscape. So we can reach out, understand tools, infrastructure, intent, and often get to the left of theft, right? Really, that's the goal for everybody, is to prevent. We really don't want the government or any institution to be really good at incident response. We've got to be ahead of that. So trying to land that threat intel into the best space we can to inform across whether it's critical infrastructure partnerships with CISA, some of the criminal activity with FBI, whether it's the defense of the national security systems and the Defense Department activities, or even out into the broader defense intelligence arena. So intel to drive all of that is number one. Number two is we've got to secure our weapons systems and platforms for the Department of Defense. We've had a number of years, working counterterrorism, counterinsurgency as a nation. That was the top priority. We weren't thinking about the near-peer challenges of a China and a Russia. And in that, we weren't always modernizing the weapons and the capabilities of the department to the level we need, and we are laser focused on that right now. So it's getting the capabilities. These things are often wings with computers strapped to them, floating computers, flying computers, exploding computers, and we haven't always treated them as things that we had to protect like computer networks. And so now the instrumentation, the protection, the modernization is really a high priority. The other thing we're doing is We've stood up the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, and that is an outreach effort to the defense industrial base, protecting and working to take that superpower of intelligence and operationalize it. It's no good if we know it and don't do anything about it. And we've had some really awesome activities over the course of the last 9 months where we've been behind some pretty big activities to disrupt at scale, places where we took information from the defense industrial base, married it with SIGINT, had an analytic ongoing conversation, so not just information getting thrown over the fence, but the deep analyst to deep analyst, and then that information spread out into other sectors, and we were able to help contribute to bigger defensive outcomes that scaled much beyond the defense industrial base. Talking to companies who are cloud providers, infrastructure providers, where their dedicated defense teams talk to the SIGINTers and do it at an unclassified level so that it can be operationalized, that's really magical.
You mentioned the cloud there, and I wonder if you could talk about, from the NSA and the Cybersecurity Directorate perspective, how does the shift to the cloud change the way that you all do your work?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the move to the cloud has both benefits and problems. You know, I talked years ago, the cloud is just a fancy way to say somebody else's computer, right? And so now what you're doing is you're trusting them to run a lot of the security aspects, make some infrastructure and architecture decisions that you don't get to participate in now. So that's a downside. The upside is most of the big cloud providers are really outstandingly resourced with exceptional people, and they get to see activity at scale. They get to look at, across a number of customers, what threats are coming at them, so they get to maneuver with a sophistication even large companies and especially small and mediums can't. So very beneficial. But the downside is now, if you've got this cloud system, it used to be we could take a box, a server into our lab, and we could shake it until the vulnerabilities fell out. And then we could talk about how to mitigate those vulnerabilities or how to get them patched and upgraded so that they're no longer a liability. I can't go ahead and grab somebody's cloud infrastructure and shake it till the vulnerabilities fall out, right? And so we're reliant on them and their processes to do that same thing. And so the question is that the visibility and the expertise that is necessary? We probably got to find some ways to just make sure that the systemic risk in some of those cloud architectures really take advantage of all the knowledge across the community.
Mm-hmm. And we've spent a lot of this day talking about systemic risk and the way that sort of government and the private sector can collaborate, should collaborate around this. What are the systemic risks from your seat that keep you up at night and that you wish we were paying better attention to as a industry and as a society right now?
For me, looking at the national security space and the defense industrial space, it's tech debt. Right? There's a lot of things we know need to be modernized, upgraded, changed, but it's getting the resources and the will to put the investment in there. That's certainly one thing. Second thing I'll highlight is I'm starting to get very focused on quantum-resistant cryptography. Mm-hmm. It's a question of when that computer will arrive. For those of us that have to secure classified information for decades, we're already in that window that, you know, the potential for one emerging could put information at risk that we want to protect. I'm less worried about that as a big, surprise event and more focused on it's just a big lift to go through and understand everywhere in your system that you have confidentiality algorithms, encryption algorithms, but also authentication protocols that rely on things that'll be vulnerable to a quantum computer. And so it's really starting to think about how do we plan for that? You know, it's a Y2K problem with orders of magnitude bigger.
And how well do you think NSA is doing at that progress towards quantum-resistant encryption? I mean, this is the NSA is sort of the people that we asked to do, the world's most sophisticated math and the world's most sophisticated encryption. And how do you think you're handling that mission right now?
So I'm feeling really good. There are, for the classified networks, we already have the protocols and the encryption technology. We're working with our partners at NIST, who are running a public competition to select the commercial standards, and that's proceeding apace. But it really is, after you have those things, it's the retrofit. It's the get it into everything and build it backwards.
You have a unique background coming into the role that you do now as the former head of TAO within the NSA. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of what lessons and approaches you bring from sort of going from an offense role into a defense role.
Yeah, so I really subscribe to the model, it takes a thief to catch a thief, right? The idea that doing and actively exploiting makes you understand with a different mindset where the vulnerabilities and weaknesses really are. And so that informs where we prioritize on defense all the time. I think the key aspect is we put in the time to win on an exploitation effort at a much greater level than often the defensive teams do. And so there's a lesson in that, right? You've got to know, Jen Easterly talked earlier, you can't defend a system if you can't see a system. Well, you can't defend the system if you don't know the system. So understanding that technology, things like software bill of materials, been brought up several times today. The idea of really penetration testing and challenging your assumptions about your network and infrastructure. The as designed is different than the as built, and that's where the exploiters win. And so you've got to come up with concepts that continually understand how you're configured, how you're upgraded, and then you've got to move at a pace and a scale that when there are brand new vulnerabilities and techniques, you've got to kind of retroactively go back and say, how is that going to impact me, and what do we need to do? There's no doubt that systems will be penetrated. The question is, how fast can you recognize, and then how fast can you respond to either limit that or drive things out to the point you have confidence again?
Let me ask you sort of a final question here about COVID and the NSA. Sort of one of the conversations we've all been having here over meal tables is the way that work is going to change for companies going forward. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how COVID has changed the way that the NSA works, and what, if any, changes you think it's going to look different going forward based on the way that the world has changed in the last 18 months.
Great question. It really accelerated our drive to unclassified systems. That wasn't a natural place for NSA, an organization of secrets, and so it pushed us to really look and say what has to be classified and what can be done on the outside. So a lot of technology development, software development, HR processes, business processes either moved to the low side or are being moved to the low side. It also really increased the demand and the resilience of our low side networks, where we never had to do at scale. So it changed us like the rest of the world. There's still a lot of work that has to be done in SCIFs and in classified environments. And we were one of the first federal government organizations to come back 100%. And so there will be things that won't change in that environment. But especially cybersecurity, we're appreciating how much more we can do on the low side.
Great. Rob, Joyce, thank you so much for joining us at the Aspen Cyber Summit. That does it for us today. Tune in next Wednesday, same time, same place, for the day 2 of the Aspen Cyber Summit. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, PwC, and then our sponsors, Autodesk and McKinsey & Company, for helping to take today's conversations possible. So, Rob, thanks.
Thanks for hosting such a great event.